Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Charts with Dan. It is a new era of Charts with me here on my channel now. Thank you so much for watching. It's been an amazing first week last week as we're launching the channel, and I'm really excited to be getting back into the box office, what little of it there is, as well as doing just weird number stuff. I enjoy it more than is probably healthy, so thank you for joining me, and let's get right down into it. Again, what little there is to get into. It's pretty much the same show as it's always been. I've got some numbers, I've got some charts, I've got my bullet points printed out here in front of me, and let's just go through what there is to see. So before we get into the weekend box office, as it is, I thought maybe we would jump back and see pretty much where we're frozen in carbonite. Where did the box office freeze when the studio stopped reporting numbers? And I think that that's actually a very important distinction to make. It's not that there aren't any studio films playing anywhere in the United States right now. They are playing at a handful of drive-in theaters, places that are able to stay open. However, what happened several weeks ago is that the studios decided to stop reporting numbers. So that's a big part of why there's no box office returns for any big studio movie. It's not because necessarily they're making $0, although they are making very little money. It's because the studios all decided to stop reporting the numbers. And that's where the box office numbers come from. They're not gathered by a third-party service. They're certainly reported by a lot of third-party services. But the box office numbers each weekend come from the studios themselves as they gather the data that's coming in from the theaters. So that's why you're not seeing anything for major new releases, and that's why these numbers are all completely frozen in time until the next movie that opens. So let's look at the 2020 domestic box office so far. Bad Boys for Life remains the #1 movie of the year domestically, and the next movie scheduled from a major studio for wide release doesn't come until Tenet, Christopher Nolan's new movie, is released in July. July 17th is when Tenet is currently on the schedule. So we are looking at a minimum of 2.5 more months before there is another wide release from a major studio, even on the horizon. Now, whether Tenet is going to make that date, whether it's going to be safe for movie theaters to open in mid-July, that's very much up in the air, but that's the earliest that we're going to see a new release from a major studio in theaters. That's also probably going to be the first time that we see numbers reported from major studios again. So some of these movies may go up and may go down depending on when they come back into theaters, but these are pretty much going to be frozen where they are for the next 2.5 months. AMC, for example, has stated that it doesn't even plan to reopen until Tenet is coming out. So this is the state of the box office that we're looking at here domestically. Let's look at the worldwide numbers for 2020, keeping in mind also, not only are studios not reporting worldwide numbers either, but studios largely are not having films play in most of these countries because theaters are shut down almost everywhere in the world, if not everywhere in the world, at least on a large scale. So, looking at 2020, Bad Boys for Life, also the #1 movie worldwide. Onward, which was the last major release before theaters started shuttering here in the US and then everywhere around the world. That process had already begun and certainly accelerated. Onward is still just barely over the $100 million mark worldwide. That's going to make it Pixar's lowest worldwide grosser by over $200 million if it doesn't open in any other marketplaces. Birds of Prey, if you look at that movie, the DCEU's lowest worldwide grosser by over $150 million if it doesn't open in any other markets. And then if you look at Sonic the Hedgehog, that movie, they've got to be wondering what might have been. It's over $300 million, but keep in mind that is absent planned openings that it had in China, Japan, several other major markets. So the outlook for Sonic looks very strong, but it could have been even stronger if this crisis had not happened and it had been allowed to open in these other markets as planned. So as I mentioned, there are some studios that report numbers. The major studios are not, but some of the smaller studios are, and that's where we're seeing weekend returns from some of these films. So let's look at the box office top 5 for this weekend, although it's really a box office top 3, because the #1 movie of the weekend is True History of the Kelly Gang, the #1 movie of the weekend with a total gross of $9,839. Now keep in mind, that's not per theater. That's total in all showings across all theaters that reported numbers, $9,839 in 5 theaters nationwide. It's also been made available on VOD. This is a movie that premiered in Toronto last year. It stars George McKay from 1917, Nicholas Hoult, Thomasin McKenzie, Charlie Hunnam, Russell Crowe, among others. And the director made an adaptation of Macbeth that got a lot of buzz a few years ago, starring Michael Fassbender. Also directed Assassin's Creed, which also directed Michael Fassbender. Didn't quite get as much buzz. The number 2 film of the weekend is Pahokee, which is a documentary feature. This played a little bit differently. It played in 85 virtual screenings or virtual theaters. It's a virtual theater in that they had a pairing with 85 different movie theaters, individual theaters around the country. You could buy a ticket to watch the movie at home, but 50% of the gross went back to those theaters. So it's essentially like watching a movie at home, but 50% of the money going toward the theater that you want to support. I've seen this with several movies. Some of them are going strictly VOD. Some of them are playing on whatever small handful of screens they can find and also going on VOD. This is kind of a weird combination of both. Now, despite being available to buy tickets or to see in 85 virtual theaters, Pahokee came in way behind True History of the Ned Kelly Gang, several $1,000 behind. So this is certainly a method that I think a lot of theater owners are going to be in favor of because it gets a little revenue going. However, not a lot of revenue generated by this film. And then the number 3 movie is a movie called Resistance, starring Jesse Eisenberg. He plays legendary mime Marcel Marceau, and it's about his efforts with the French resistance during World War II, which is a fascinating story I knew absolutely nothing about. This was, again, getting some good buzz, but because of the current crisis, who knows how the release and the buzz around this movie could have changed. It came in 3rd place, playing in only 1 theater, and this 1 theater is actually very interesting. It's the 1 theater that reported grosses for this movie, Resistance, and it is the Ocala Drive-In in Ocala, Florida, which over the last several weeks has gained prominence for being one of the very few screens actually showing new movies in the entire United States. It's also playing Trolls World Tour, a Universal release that went straight to VOD, that played on very few screens, had a full worldwide and national launch planned, but is not doing that. And just for fun, it's playing Back to the Future. So I'm sure that there's going to be volumes or certainly an interesting story to be built around the Ocala Drive-In in Ocala, Florida, because if you're a movie fan and you want to see movies projected on a big screen, it is one of the only places, and in the case of Resistance, the only place in the country, at least as far as theaters reporting numbers, that you could see that film on the big screen and not on home on VOD. As we go through this, I think it's important to judge, and obviously very little, significantly, statistically, nothing coming in as far as box office grosses for this entire month of April as we get to the end of the month. Just how bad of a hit has the box office taken? So to do that, I decided to look at the numbers, the cumulative gross from January through April. So you total up all the money domestically that the box office has made from January through April. How much is it for every year from 2010 to 2020, and how does this stack up for us this year? So here are the raw numbers, cumulative domestic box office gross from January through April. And as you can see, prior to this year, the lowest gross cumulatively for the box office was 2010, just under $2.5 billion. It hasn't gotten lower than that until this year. Just last year, the gross of the box office from January through April domestically was just below $3.5 billion. This year, it is less than $2 billion. And keep in mind, that's including 2 months in January and February, where theaters are pretty much open for business as usual, and that had an increase over January and February of last year. So we were actually, prior to this crisis, on track to do better than last year domestically at the box office. And of course, it fell off a cliff. Practically nothing generated for the month of April. And as we go forward, as we approach the fact that theaters are going to be closed for wide releases through May, seemingly through June, this disparity is only going to get worse. And it looks bad here. I think the difference is even more pronounced when you adjust the figures for inflation, which you know me, of course I did. So when you adjust the figures for inflation, the drop for 2020 gets even more pronounced, with 2010 being the last year that grosses dipped below even $3 billion. And to see where we are now, I will keep track of this at the end of every month just to see cumulatively how much the box office disparity is going to be. Keep in mind, when we get to the end of May and we're comparing how the box office did this year, especially compared to last year at the end of May, that's a bulk of the run of Avengers Endgame. Massive box office grosses compared to zero. So that may look like a steep drop off now. That drop off is only going to get worse because the cumulative gross for the box office domestically in past years is going to keep going up, and we're pretty much going to stay right where we are. So I will continue to track this at the end of every month so we can see just how big of an impact this crisis has had on the domestic box office. Now, of course, this upcoming weekend was supposed to be the opening weekend of Black Widow, the kickoff of the summer movie season. Black Widow's release date has now been pushed back to November 6th. And something that I was kind of trying to figure out in my head was, how big, as far as historically with the MCU, is that gap? How long has it been between releases of Marvel movies? Is this the biggest release as far as days go between the release of one Marvel movie and the release of the next? So my lovely research assistant Mara and I looked at the numbers, and this is what we found. Now, assuming that Black Widow hits its new release date of November 6th, it will be the second longest gap between releases in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, behind the nearly 700 days between The Incredible Hulk in 2008 and Iron Man 2 in 2010. After those first two movies in the MCU, Iron Man and Incredible Hulk, came out in summer 2008, you had a whole summer, almost a 2-year gap before Iron Man 2 came out and continued the MCU. So this gap between Black Widow and Spider-Man Far From Home, if it stands, if that release date of Black Widow stands, will be the second longest gap between MCU releases. And these two gaps, the top two, will be the only two that span more than one calendar year, because as you can see, the gap between Iron Man 2 and Thor and the gap between the Avengers and Iron Man 3 was 364 days. 1 day short of a calendar year. So these will be the only two gaps between MCU releases that were more than a year long. And as you can see at the end there, the average release gap between MCU movies is 186 days. Black Widow, the time between Spider-Man Far From Home and Black Widow's release is going to more than double that number. Now, when we're looking at the MCU, the other thing that has been big news, and I've seen a lot of coverage about it, and really is astonishing when you think about where we were a year ago versus where we are today, is that we are just a year removed from me sitting in a chair much like this one talking about the record-breaking box office opening of Avengers Endgame, which of course set global records, set domestic records, it set just about every record you could possibly set for the opening of a movie, and ultimately the overall gross of a movie, particularly worldwide. I decided to do a little experiment, and as you know, when I get a wild hair in these shows and decide to do a little experiment, of course this is all theoretical. I'm not trying to make a definitive case here, but I wanted to try an experiment and see, what if circumstances were different? What if things had moved down a year? What if releases had come down a year? What would it have taken, given the limitations that the theatrical market is likely to face when it reopens? What would it have taken for Avengers Endgame to have reached that same record-breaking opening? So this is just one scenario out of many scenarios I'm sure you could draw, but I wanted to just sort of illustrate exactly what would have to happen for theaters to be opening at a limited capacity, but for the movie to still hit that record-breaking opening. So first of all, there's a little bit of research that I did. Keep in mind, even though Avengers Endgame opened in a specific number of theaters, each one of those theaters has multiple screens. So a theater is not one movie screen. A theater is a building inside of which you have multiple screens. Now, according to NATO, the National Association of Theater Owners, the average indoor theater has approximately 7 screens. According to several reports, it's likely that theaters may reopen, and we're talking in a best case scenario, using what's called a checkerboard seating arrangement. That means that you'll be seated somewhere, there will be nobody in front of you, there will be nobody behind you, there will be nobody to the side of you. Everyone's essentially sitting diagonally from each other, like the setup of a checkerboard. And that would put seating arrangements at 50% capacity. So best case scenario, I think when theaters are opening up, you're talking about theaters having 50% capacity of what they normally would. So again, for the purposes of this experiment, we're assuming that all 4,662 theaters that played Endgame will devote all 7 of its screens. So we're saying they're playing full court basketball here. They're devoting all 7 of its screens on average to showing the movie. That means that each individual screen, in order to replicate that opening gross, would need to earn $10,943 on opening weekend. Now, again, we're talking peak efficiency. We're saying this is the first movie that's opening, and the theater owners and staff are highly motivated to get as many people into the theater, and that the audience is as highly motivated to see the film as they possibly can be. So let's say the theater staff is running a theater around the clock, which many of them did, and that they're working at peak efficiency. Now, given that Endgame has a runtime of 3 hours, I'm assuming that each individual screen operating 24 hours straight could play the movie 6 times a day. That's 3 hours for the movie. Then you have an hour that would encompass cleaning, loading in, loading out, 15 minutes of previews. That is a tight timetable. But again, we're playing optimum here. We're going, everything is going at peak efficiency. So 6 times a day per individual screen times 3 days. When you take into account the reported 2019 ticket price in the second quarter of last year of $9.26, means that 1,182 tickets would need to be sold for each individual screen over the weekend. Now, this means that each individual screen showing Avengers Endgame in the United States would need a minimum audience of 66 people per showing in order for Endgame to hit its record-breaking opening number. That means that each theater would need a capacity on average of 132 people, because keep in mind, you're operating at 50% capacity. So in order to fit all 66 people into that theater, you would need to have a total capacity of 132. So could Endgame replicate that opening number? Well, yes, it could, but it would require a remarkable effort on the part of theater owners and employees and on audiences to show up to the film. And keep in mind, this is running at the maximum number of screens and the maximum number of showtimes. So this is assuming that every theater that played Endgame would devote every one of its screens, which is 7 screens on average, to playing Endgame 24 hours a day straight, cycling people in with just an hour of loading in, loading out, trailers, etc. for each movie. This would be a titanic feat, but I wanted to do an experiment where we're talking optimal results. Keep in mind, this is probably not what would happen. Not every screen would probably be playing Avengers Endgame. Not every theater would probably be able to turn over people at that rate. So as you would have fewer screens or fewer showings, keep in mind the average number of people that would have to be in every single one of those screenings goes up. And then you start running into theater capacity issues, public health guidelines. So I think it is theoretically possible that if Avengers Endgame were to be released in the aftermath of the kind of crisis that we're going through right now, that it could hit that same number. But I think it's very unlikely given the limitations and given the fact that you would have to have remarkable consistency across so many areas. Now, would it be incredible for a movie like Avengers Endgame to come out? Yes, I can't wait for the days when film fans can go back to the theater, can go back to seeing the movies that they've been anticipating for so long, now that so many of them have been pushed for so long. But the other thing to keep in mind is we have to make sure that we're going back safely, that we're going back at a time that is best not only for ourselves, but for the people around us, for the people that work at the movie theaters, and for the people that we interact with in our daily lives, to keep everyone safe and healthy. So, like I said, this is a thought experiment. It's not something I would advocate for, but I think it is interesting to go down these avenues and go down these alleys and think about what would something. I mean, Avengers Endgame was a movie on a scale like we have never seen before as far as its release and the audience enthusiasm. What kind of strategy would they have had? Would they have wanted to do a full court press like I'm talking about here and get it out as early as possible? Or would they have waited until later in the year? These are things and answers to questions that we'll never know. And ultimately, in the grand scheme of all this, they're questions that don't really matter that much. But I think they're still interesting questions. And it's the kind of stuff that I really want to pursue on this show. If you're not familiar with what I've done previously with charts and numbers and box office stuff, yes, I'm definitely going to be bringing you the numbers of stuff that's come in, when the box office resumes, what movies are doing well, what movies are not doing well, and we will break that down. But I also also like to do things like this because I think that there is so much more to the numbers than just the numbers. And you can tell so many things about what people choose to see and when and why and how. It really is fascinating and really is interesting. And that's why I'm excited to get this show back up and running. My goal is to have this up every Monday, as usual, breaking down what box office there is and what box office there isn't. There are a couple of really fun ideas that I have in mind for taking a look perhaps at years past and how the box office might have been regarded back then. We're going to have some fun with this show as we wait for the movie industry to be able to get safely back on its feet. But until then, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to everyone that joined the channel as a subscriber last week and everyone that's joining the channel this week and in the future. I'm very excited to get these numbers back out to you and do these weird, crazy yarn string on the wall type experiments again. And don't forget that you can also join the community that I'm building over on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. You'll be able to get everything that you get here on the YouTube channel, but you'll get some of it earlier, in addition to things like my monthly movie club, a feature-length movie commentary every month, and so much more. You can check that out over on my Patreon page. Thank you so much for tuning in to the first edition of Charts with Dan here on my new YouTube channel. I really appreciate you watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.